All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the first screencast of Chapter 21. We're going to be talking about the price level and inflation. So, what exactly is inflation? Well, inflation is a general increase in the price level. Meaning that all prices across the economy, or most prices across the economy, are increasing. All right. It's measured as the growth rate of the average price level in the economy, and we're going to dig into exactly how it's measured later on in a later screencast. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. Deflation is a general decrease in the price level, and it's measured as the negative growth rate of the average price level in the economy. Why is inflation problematic? Well, it gives you uncertainty about price changes. You can't be sure in the future what the prices of goods might be. Long-term wages and contracts are difficult if you're in an inflationary environment. It's hard to know how to write a contract for a supplier over the course of 2, 3, 5 years, or for employees over a long run time period, because you're not really sure how much the dollars that you're going to be paying in the future are going to be worth after inflation. Deflation can also be problematic, but in modern economies with fiat money, we don't really see deflation all that often. In a few minutes, I'm going to bring up a couple charts with some data that shows what inflation has looked like over the past 40 years or so. And you'll notice there's one or two small episodes of deflation, but in general, it's not a big concern in most modern economies. So one of the tools that we use to measure inflation is something called the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is a measure of the average price level based on consumption patterns of the typical consumer. The goal is to measure the cost of living. And the CPI is computed by a group called the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They're the one who decides what goes into the Consumer Price Index, which goods, and if that mix needs to be changed over time. These are the people that get to decide that. So who exactly is the Bureau of Labor Statistics? They're a government agency that reports inflation and unemployment data. They determine how much weight to put on different consumer prices when composing the Consumer Price Index. So it's right there in the name, an index. So it's made up of a collection of goods, and we look at how the price level of those different goods has changed over time. So here's what inflation looks like in the U.S., the inflation rate since 1965. And the periods in green here are periods of recession. So you can see that often inflation corresponds to some of these times of recession. What makes up the Consumer Price Index, which we use to measure inflation? Well, most of it is housing. About 16% is transportation, 15% food and beverage. Medical care is about 8%, recreation 6%. And these are the different aspects of the overall economy that economists at the Bureau of Labor Statistics use to calculate the Consumer Price Index. So they pick a basket or a bundle of goods that represent these different sectors, and about 42% of those things are different measures of housing. So each month the BLS collects price information. They use about 8,000 different goods and services in 211 categories for 38 different geographic regions in the U.S., and they use those to calculate the Consumer Price Index. So we obviously don't have time to dig into all 8,000 goods, but let me show you a quick example of what that looks like. So here we have, say, popcorn, and they're going to put 1 unit of popcorn in this fake Consumer Price Index. The unit price is $6. The total cost is $6. That's in 2016. All right. So here we have Coke, 2 units of Coke. The unit price is $5, so the total cost would be $10. And 2 movie tickets, unit price $12. Total cost within this bundle of goods is $24. So the total bundle here costs $40 in 2016. Then in 2017, we look at how the prices have changed. So the part of the bundle of goods that represents popcorn has gone up to $8 for a total cost of $8. The Coke has gotten more expensive. No, the Coke has stayed the same, and it's still $10 of the overall cost in this bundle of goods. And then movie tickets have gone up $1 for a total cost of $26. So the overall basket, or this bundle of goods, has gone to $44 from $40. So if we're using 2016 as our base year, and you always have to pick a base year when you're computing inflation or the consumer price index or the price level, if 2016 is the base year, then 40 over 40 times 100, it gets 100. So the base year will get a price level of 100. And then when we look at 2017, if you take the total cost of the bundle of goods in 2017, divide it by the total cost in your base year, 2016, times 100. So the price level in 2017 is 110 when 2016 is the base year. So that's how we go about calculating the price index. So again, it's the price index is the basket price divided by the basket price in your base year. So the basket here is 44 divided by that basket's price in the base year, which is 40, times 100. And that's how we get the CPI. So using these price level numbers, we can calculate the rate of inflation by looking at what the percent change is in the price level. So typically inflation rates are measured annually, sometimes quarterly. So what would that look like in our previous example? Well, if we looked at if we wanted to calculate the inflation rate, remember our two bundles, one had the price level of 100, one had a price level of 110. So when we go to calculate the price index for this, you do 110, the new price level for the bundle, minus the original price level for the bundle, so the change, divided by the price in the base year times 100. That's a 10% change in the price index, or a 10% level of inflation. So here are a couple graphs that show the consumer price index up here at the top. That's just the overall price level calculated in some base year. Here it's 1984. And then down here is the inflation rate. The inflation rate, again, is the change in the price level over time, the change in the CPI over time. So we can see here that inflation went up and went back down. It went up and it went back down. It's kind of got that cyclical nature, a little bit like unemployment. And we'll talk about why that is later on. But remember, the CPI is the measure of the cost of a typical consumer's basket of goods over time. The inflation rate is the percent change in that basket of goods, the percent change in the price of the basket of that goods from one year to the next. Again, this is set as 1984 as the base year. You can really use any year that you want. You just have to then be consistent across your calculations. The current level, using 84 as the base, the current price level would be about 235. So that means consumer prices have more than doubled since 1984. Inflation is about 4% over the course of this entire series. If you were to average the inflation rate all across this time series, you would find inflation is about 4% a year. Inflation, however, has been much, much higher. It was around 14.5% in the late 70s. That was one of the worst episodes in recent U.S. history of inflation. And if you actually pull that out and start calculating inflation, say at 1984, the overall level of inflation over that time period is much lower. It's around 3% instead of 4%. So another thing to note here is how rare deflation is. So deflation is where you see the negative growth rate in the consumer price index. So during the Great Recession, we saw a negative inflation or deflation. And also recently in 2015, there was a little episode of deflation, but it turned around pretty quickly. So one of the things that we can use the consumer price index for is to compare dollar values across time. Prices could be misleading from different times. If you've ever heard your parents or grandparents talk about how they used to buy milk for a nickel and stuff like that, well, it's hard to know, was that expensive or was that cheap at that point in time? It was a low dollar amount, but was that dollar amount expensive or cheap? And that's what using the consumer price index will let us do. It'll let us convert a price either from the past up into today dollars, or we can take today dollars or recent dollars and convert back to the past. We can go in either direction. And so, for example, in 1924, you could buy a fully constructed house for $1,969. Is that expensive compared to today, cheap compared to today? We can't really tell until we take into account the effect of inflation. And we can do that by using this formula. So on the left-hand side here, we have your target year dollars. So that's the dollars that you want to talk about the money in terms of. So usually it's current dollars, or in this examples, we're going to use 2015 dollars. Or you can go backwards. Like I said, you can go back to previous year's dollars. So what you do is you take the original dollar level, so the nickel for the gallon of milk in 1929 or something, and then you multiply it by your target year price level, and then you divide that by the original price level. And those price levels are those numbers that we saw before, where I think we did 1984 was 100, and today was 234 or something like that. That's what we mean by the price level. Okay, so I want to work through a few examples just to show you how we use this formula. So here's a can of Coca-Cola, a 12-ounce can in 1942 cost a nickel. All right, well, what would that be in 2015 dollars? So the price level in 2015 was 235. The price level in 1942 was 16. Again, these are both using 1984 as the base year. 1984 got the 100 in this price level calculation. So we can take that and to find what a nickel is worth in our target year's dollars, we take that nickel and we multiply it by the ratio of these two price levels. So 235 over 16 times 0.05 is 73 cents. So the can of Coca-Cola in 1942 cost a nickel. What is that nickel worth in 2015? It's 73 cents. And then you can compare that to the current price and see whether or not the item's really gotten cheaper or has really gotten more expensive. Another example here is a Hershey bar. Hershey bar in 1921. Let's try to take that up to 2015 dollars. So 2015's price level was 235. As we said before, the price level in 1921 was 18. Again, just to remind you, this is all using 1984 as your base year. 1984 gets the 100. 2015 gets 235. 1921 gets 18. So we take the price in the original dollars and multiply it by the ratio of the price level in our target year over the price level in the original year. So 5 cents times this fraction is about 65 cents. So that's what it would be in 2015 dollars. Another one here, McDonald's hamburger, 15 cents in 1955. So 1955's price level is 27 when 1984 is the base year. 2015 again, its price level is 235 when 1984 is the base level. So we just multiply that price of the McDonald's hamburger by this ratio of 235 over 27, and we end up with $1.30. So in today's dollars, this McDonald's hamburger would have cost $1.30, not 15 cents, because we've now pulled out the effect of inflation so that we can make a comparison maybe with today's price of a McDonald's hamburger to see whether it truly got more expensive or truly got cheaper depending on the direction. Last example I want to work here is Nabisco's Oreo cookies. A pound of them in 1922 cost 32 cents. So the price level in 1922 was 17. Price level in 2015 was 235. So we do 235 over 17 times the original price, and we get a price of $4.42 in 2015 dollars. So again, that lets us then compare whether this was an expensive or a cheap item in 1922 by being able to say that it would be about $4.42 in today's dollars. All right, and then we can go look at the price of Oreos today and compare. So historically, economists worried that the CPI might overstate the true level of inflation upwards. So the inflation number, the CPI might be, or the change in the CPI, the measure of inflation, might be too low. And there are three possible reasons. One could be something called the substitution bias. One could be something about the changes in the quality of goods over time. And the last thing could be that new products and locations could throw off the calculation of the consumer price index. So let's talk about each of these briefly. So the substitution bias is that when the price of a good A rises, consumers may substitute away from that good into another good B. And so if that's what's happening, the consumers are still spending money on the other good, and its price level may be changing. But if A is in the CPI and B is not in the CPI, then it's going to throw off the calculation of the consumer price index. So since 1999, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has used a formula that tries to account for this. So they realized that the CPI might be undercounting inflation. And so in 99 and 2000, as we're going to see with one of the other issues, they made some changes in the way that they calculate these different indices of the price level. So another concern with that the CPI may be misstating the actual level of inflation is changes in quality in the goods that are in the CPI bundle or the basket of goods. Prices may be rising, but it might be because the goods are becoming of better and better quality. It might not be just an overall rise in the price level for the same quality of good. So for example, these tube TVs in the early 90s versus the flat screens. Okay, well, the price may rise, the price may fall, but that's a completely different good with a completely different quality. So we can't just include the price level flat, the overall price level, or even the price level per inch of the size of the television. So since about 1999, this was another change that the BLS made into the way that things were calculated. They've tried to account for the fact that that the items in the basket of goods in the CPI might have changed in quality a great deal. So going from cell phones like this in the 80s and early 90s to cell phones like this in the OOs and the teens that we're in right now. The last thing that might cause a misstatement of the level of inflation is when new goods and services and different locations appear in terms of places where people buy and sell things. So, for example, things like flash drives and iPads. These are completely new types of consumer goods. In some cases, we get entirely new classes of goods, new industries altogether. Previously, the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the CPI were updated very, very rarely. They didn't want to keep changing the basket of goods, and you can imagine why that might be, because that would introduce a bias of its own if you are continually adjusting the basket of goods. But as the economy has become more and more dynamic, that's become a second-order concern from these other three concerns about how the price level may be misstated by the CPI. New product prices often drop after a couple of years. That's another reason that the BLS has updated the way that they calculate the CPI. Retail outlets appear, such as online stores. They usually offer better prices. That also puts downward pressure on prices, and that needs to be taken into account because that's not an overall change in the price level of the whole economy. It's just the price level within those particular industries going up or going down. So how does the BLS account for this new products issue within the CPI? Well, since about 2000, they've created something called the chained CPI. And this is a different model of how to calculate the consumer price index in order to take into account the changes in the economy, the more dynamic nature of the economy. The chained CPI was what was created. It's a little more difficult to measure because, again, you're constantly re-evaluating and changing the bundle of goods that's in that CPI bundle. And most current reports from the BLS and the ones you hear from the government, the ones you hear on the news, they still don't use the chained CPI. So this new chained CPI also incorporates those previous changes that were made due to the substitution bias and due to the changes in quality bias. So it has all three of these concerns taken into account. And as we can see here, this is the traditional consumer price index. And this is the chained consumer price index. So notice that the chained consumer price index has a lower level of inflation overall. And something that's interesting is that they're separating over time. There's a wider and wider gap between these two. So before we move on to the next screencast, I'd like to give a couple of multiple choice questions at the end here just to help you with remembering what we've covered in this screencast. Which of the following spending categories makes up the largest portion of the CPI? If you remember, we had a pie chart up and it was like 41% of the CPI. Was it travel? Was it housing? Was it entertainment? Was it food? And that's right, you playing along at home, it was housing. Housing makes up the largest component of the consumer price index. Another question. If inflation is a general rise in the overall price level in the economy, why have consumer electronic prices fallen over time? All right. And that's fallen over time after adjusting for inflation, right? So we're doing that calculation to pull out the effect of inflation. Then we see the falling prices of consumer goods. Why is that? Is it that the demand for electronics has decreased? Is it that electronics are not counted in the CPI? They're not in that bundle? Is it that electronics are getting smaller in size, so the price falls because they're smaller? Or is it that increases in technology have greatly reduced production costs for these goods? And so the price falling is actually part of the production process becoming more efficient and more cost effective. And yes, you guessed it, you can always just say on a multiple choice exam, maybe it's just the longest one, because why would you take so much time to write an incorrect answer? And if you guessed that, you would be correct here. It is increases in technology that have caused the real reduction in the cost of these consumer electronics, even though the dollar amount that's on the price tag may be a great deal more. When we account for that inflation by doing the calculation with the consumer price index, we find that actually these electronics have gotten cheaper. All right, so that's the end of Screencast 1, and I'll see you on the other side in Screencast 2 for Chapter 21.